Season 2 of Written in Stone is generously supported by RAB, one of climbing's most historic brands. Founded in 1981 by climbers, for climbers, RAB are on a journey to reduce the impact of their business, expand access to the outdoors, and preserve our mountain playgrounds for future generations. RAB. The mountains are our meeting place. I make my living as a climbing coach. The board I recommend more than any other is the Tension Board 2. As an early adopter of systemized spray walls, it's what I always imagined boards had the potential to be. You can learn more about the TB2 at their in-depth article on what it is, how it came to be, and how to use it the way they intended, with progression toward mastery in mind. The link is in the show notes. In August of 1985, two of France's brightest climbers, Gilbert Tribut and Antoine Le Ménestrel, traveled to Sheffield. They wanted to do the new hard routes going up there, and while they were welcomed and the visit was friendly, they distinctly remembered how Jerry Moffatt had all but destroyed the French standards just a couple of years earlier. As usual, the forecast called for rain, so they went to the steep walls of Raventor and dropped their rope beneath Revelations. At 8A or 13B, the route had been established by Jerry a year earlier. Jerry, however, was now out of climbing entirely with severe elbow problems. After just one working go, Antoine fired it. The hardest route in the country, second try, a slap in the face. But that just wasn't enough. Over the next several days, Antoine climbs the route 7 more times, and then, on a perfect weather day in the early evening as the crag empties of climbers, he senses that it's time. He starts up again, this time with no rope. He writes in his diary, "I am at the foot of the route. My head is empty, my body filled with concentration. The moves are linked in perfection. No hesitation, no unnecessary movement, no tension, just total concentration all the way to the top. I climbed into a state of grace as I had never before climbed." Moffatt, who over the previous few years had gone to France, Germany, and the US, climbed their hardest routes and delighted in burning off the best climbers in the area, could do absolutely nothing to respond. He just had to take it. In his book, also called Revelations, he writes, I was gutted. I'm Chris Hampton. You're listening to Written in Stone, climbing's most important ascents. This is Season 2, the 1980s.
1, 2.
In the 1970s, French climber Jean-Claude Droyer was invited to Wales by the English Climbing Federation, and it's on this trip that he realizes the potential of free climbing. What the English were doing was remarkable, and he brings those ideas back to his local crag, Les Sassois, and decides to push the idea of removing points of aid and instead free climbing. In 1979, he cleans up an old line out of steep bulge with an intricate sequence and begins working it. Falling, hanging on the rope, trying again. Unheard of. His friend Jean-Pierre Bouvier joins him and eventually, in 1981, cracks the code. Chimpanzodrome, the first 7C+, or 13A, in France. 3 years later, in the spring of 1984, 20-year-old Jerry Moffatt, fresh off of destroying standards in the US and Germany, traveled to France to see what he could pick off there. He brought with him his young protege, Ben Moon. We told this story in the first episode this season, Patrick Edlanger is a rock star, but it's worth telling again here. Ben and Jerry went first to Sassois, where Jerry would quickly make the first non-French ascent of the new hardest route in the country, Les Bidouilles. Meanwhile, Moon was projecting Chimpanzedrome, his first 7C+, and Moffatt watched closely as he worked out the moves. The following Sunday was Jerry's 21st birthday, and he had a gift in mind for himself, a flash attempt of the famous Chimpanzedrome. A route of this grade had never been flashed before, but that made Jerry all the more confident. From his book, Revelations. Sunday climbers had arrived from Paris, and the normally deserted crag looked like a different place. The French were immaculate, with beautiful matching tops and bottoms, hair coiffed, perfect suntans, and toweling headbands. Their carabiners all matched. They were also clean. We mingled with the Parisians like two dogs. Ben, with his pasty white skin, looked about 15. His long black hair was starting to mat into dreadlocks. His clothes were filthy. I too had scruffy clothes, holes in my trousers, my hair dyed into black and red patches, punk style. We went over to our cave and got our gear on, and I warmed up by doing a 7B overhang, first go, which attracted some attention from the French. They watched us go over to Chimpanzedrome. At the time, I always climbed in my lucky Swami belt, a simple ribbon of webbing with no leg loops to keep myself light. I tied on to a single rope, 9mm in diameter, and fired the pitch off, first try. I ripped it to bits. Straight after, Ben too went up it once more like a rat up a drain pipe. The French were stunned. We wandered to the sleeping cave, and as we had done everything that we wanted to do, packed our bags. We might as well head south. Au revoir! And head south they did, to the Verdon, where Jerry would one-up himself by on-sighting Pol Pot, a 7C+ from Marc Le Ménestrel, firmly establishing himself as the best on-site climber on the planet. He would then, in 2 tries, finish an old project bolted and tried by Patrick Edlanger, Pappy on-site, also at 7C+. The pair returned to the UK, having done everything there was to do, leaving the French climbers in awe. And being home didn't slow him down. He first went to the Peak District and established the incredible arête of Messiah, the hardest route on Gritstone. At Raventor, he figured out the direct start to Ron Fawcett's The Prow to create the first 8A+ in the UK, Revelations. He then went to Yosemite, where he did the first in-a-day ascent of Midnight Lightning and on-sighted another 13A, the Phoenix. At that moment, in 1984, there's not much debate. Jerry Moffatt was the best climber in the world with the most momentum. Within a year, he'd be out of climbing completely. His obsessive training and climbing routine, with barely any days off, had some unintended consequences. After a hard-won battle with the Phoenix, his elbows were so bad he could barely even touch rock without pain shooting up his arms. A several-week break provided enough relief that he could manage a day here and there to climb, so he traveled down to Joshua Tree and met up with his friend Gilbert Tribou and the Le Ménestrel brothers. From J-Tree, the crew made their way to a recently rediscovered area called Waco Tanks, where they wandered the desert, climbing untouched rock and leaving no record of what they saw, tried, or climbed. And Jerry didn't do much climbing, but he did love hanging out with friends and exploring the new zones. When he returned to Joshua Tree, John Backer got in touch with him. He'd heard about Jerry's elbow problems and knew a specialist in LA who worked with the Hollywood elite. Backer, who'd been raking in the money distributing the first sticky rubber shoes for Boreal, offered to pay for Jerry to go see the specialist. Jerry writes, "Backer was capable of some of the most frustrating and incomprehensible behavior I have ever come across. At the same time, he was also capable of the most amazing displays of generosity." The doctor diagnosed Jerry in 15 minutes. Severe tendinitis. For the next several months, Jerry stayed in California and followed the rehab protocols. He followed a specific diet, did nothing active but swim and rehab, and made absolutely no progress at all. Before long, he had to go back to the UK, where he moved in with Andy Pollitt and Martin Atkinson. And they were climbing well, but it only served to highlight his own lack of life focus. His only money came from the dole and from climbing. Now, he was sliding into depression, feeling unemployable, with no chance of ever climbing again. And then, Gibet and Antoine Le Ministrel came to the UK, and Antoine soloed his hardest route. It hit Jerry hard. He needed something to take his mind off the climbing world passing him by. Ron Fawcett had ridden a motorcycle, Ben Moon and Chris Gore each had one, and Jerry appreciated that power. So he bought a bike. Late in 1985, Jerry rode his bike to Germany to visit Wolfgang and Kurt. He wasn't climbing, but enjoyed being around his friends. Norbert Betz and Norbert Sandner, both of whom owned outdoor shops, each gave him a part-time job. He earned just enough to spend every weekend skiing. As 1986 rolled around, Jerry was still in Germany, but still not climbing. Norbert Sandner asked about Jerry's elbows, which hadn't shown any improvement at all, and suggested that he knew a doctor in Munich who might be able to help. Norbert called him up and got Jerry an appointment. After an hour, the doctor delivered the news. He didn't have tendonitis at all. No amount of time and work would heal this injury. It was a compressed nerve that would require surgery on both arms. And the first surgery could be done the next morning. Jerry agreed. We'll be right back. This episode of Written in Stone is brought to you by Rab. For more than 40 years, Rab have been crafting rugged, high-performance clothing and equipment that give you absolute protection, comfort, and freedom in the mountains. With roots in the climbing community of Sheffield, UK, they're dedicated climbers themselves, and they channel this expertise and passion into their designs. Nothing fancy or over-engineered, just honest, hard-working gear you'd rather repair than replace. Rab are on a journey to reduce the impact of their business, make it fairer for everyone, and expand access to the outdoors, whether it's phasing out fluorocarbons or giving used gear a second life through their service center. They're committed to preserving our mountain playground for future generations. With both surgeries done, Jerry stayed in Germany a little longer doing rehab and riding his motorcycle. That would continue once he was back home in the UK, where he again moved in with climbing friends. So, even though he didn't feel his elbows were improving, he was still around climbing enough that he hadn't entirely escaped. Ben Moon suggested he go see a physio that Ben had just seen. Nothing to lose, Jerry went. After having a look, the physio was confused. "Get on with it," he told Jerry. "There's nothing wrong with those elbows apart from the fact that you're not using them. Push them, hammer them, do everything you would have done before. They're fine." It was now September 1986, nearly 2 years after he'd stepped away. After all this time seeing doctors and doing rehab exercises, he finally felt like he'd been given the permission that he needed. He started slow, lifting weights, gaining strength. When spring of '87 rolled around, he was excited to get back on the rock. But Jerry was used to climbing at a certain standard, so when he went to one of his favorite training traverses, one that he used to lap easily, and could only barely do the moves, he felt away. A whole range of ways, actually. Frustrated, then downright angry, then determined. He built his climbing back up, and feeling pretty good, went to Raven Tour with Ben Moon and Ben Masterson. They showed him an unclimbed traverse that moved left across a scooped-out, overhanging wall. Ben Masterson demonstrated some of the sequence. Jerry couldn't do a single move. "Bloody hell, Ben, you made that look easy." "Well, Jerry, a few things have changed since you've been away." That determination was about to go through the roof. As soon as the frustration faded, that is. Over the next few weeks, Jerry returned to the traverse again and again, fueled by Masterson's words. This traverse represented more than just a sequence across a random chunk of rock, stepping on and off at relatively arbitrary spots. Each move was another step toward being back to his former self. Every link brought him closer to being, once more, the best. After 3 weeks of work, Jerry managed the traverse. At V9, it wasn't exactly state-of-the-art, but it wasn't far behind either. Regardless, he was the first to complete it, and for him, making a comeback, this meant something. He called it power band, the range of RPMs in which an engine operates at its best, between peak torque and peak horsepower. Jerry wasn't back at his peak, but he hadn't reached his highest gear yet either. There was still room to open the throttle. But Ben Masterson was right. Things had changed. In the brief time that Jerry was focused on his bike, bolts had become the norm and difficulty the main goal. Buick's was the crag of the moment, with the most dense collection of hard routes. Yo-yoing was all but gone. Nearly everyone had adopted redpoint tactics. Jerry knew he had to go to Buick's, and in the spring of '87, he went straight to their hardest, a contrasting pair of side-by-side routes established by Antoine and Marc Le Ménestrel. La Rage de Vivre and Les Minimum were two of only a handful of 8B pluses, or 14As, in the world at the time. He dove into both routes simultaneously, working out the fierce, powerful sequences of Les Minimum while building fitness on the massive endurance test piece, La Rage. Just as he was feeling good, tragedy threatened to take him back out of climbing again. Jerry got a message that his brother Toby, going to school in the U.S., had died in an accident. He was only 21. Jerry left Buick's and, despite trying to climb, just couldn't focus. But like many of us, climbing was one of his constants through this time. He eventually found his way through. He remembered Antoine Le Ménestrel soloing Revelations. He remembered that he had unfinished business at Buick's. Wolfgang Gulisch had just done the first 8C, Wall Street. He was determined not to get left further behind. He remembered that he was Jerry Moffatt. But what we have to remember is that in 1985, when Jerry left the game, Wolfgang had only just established the first 8B. The hardest thing Jerry had climbed was 8A+, or 13C. It was now fall of 1987, and difficulty had skyrocketed all the way to 14B. There were dozens of people climbing 13C. His determination wasn't going to be enough. There was a lot of work to be done to catch up. He could feel that competitive spirit building. First, he decided to lean into the idea of bolting things himself. When he'd repeated Ben Moon's statement of youth in 1984, he noticed a subtle groove off to the left. It was steeper and more blank than statement, and looked almost impossible, but it stuck out enough to be remembered years later. He returned to lower Pentruan and wrapped down the line, putting in bolts as he went and finding just enough holds. Maybe. It took many days just to sort out the individual moves, and linking it would be a different beast altogether. With the good season at Buick's coming, and his unfinished business there, it would have to wait. Back at Buick's with Sean Miles, over a few weeks, Jerry managed to redpoint La Rose et la Vampire, the first half of La Rage, and his first 13D. As temperatures dropped and momentum grew, he kept chipping away at both routes, improving not only his fitness in getting the moves dialed, but also learning the intricacies of the redpoint process. La Rage went first, its second ascent, and in an ambitious attempt, Les Minimum almost went down the same day. First try of the next day, it did, for its third ascent. Jerry was elated, of course, but he knew there was more work to be done. That winter, Jerry went back to Germany to hang with Wolfgang and Kurt. While preparing for Wall Street, Wolfgang had developed his new training tool, the Campus Board. Jerry recognized the power of this tool right away. No pun intended. He began adapting it to his needs, moving some rungs, changing some out for others, and coming up with difficult project sequences. For the entire winter, he trained on the board. In spring, he went back to Buttes. A new route had gone up at the end of 1987, another 8B+, this one by Gilbert Tribou. Le Spectre du Sieur Mouton, the ghost of the super mutant. Jerry began working it, expecting a siege like he'd made the previous fall, but after only 2 days, he was ready, and took a rest day in anticipation. This, a rest day, may have been Jerry's biggest evolution. Feeling fresh, he sent on his first try of the next day, becoming the first person to do all 3 8B+ at Buttes. Not quite content, he moved his rope and on-sighted an 8A. Then he did an 8A+ on his second try. And it all came down to the power. Jerry Moffatt was back. Look, I make my living as a climbing coach, but I'll be the first to tell you that ever since climbers first decided they wanted to get better, there's been one best way to improve: climb intentionally. So if you can do your climbing on terrain that was built specifically for that, it's a cheat code. And when it comes to this, there's one training board out there that stands above the rest: the Tension Board 2. Here's why. It was designed by people who actually train on boards. With mastery in mind, every decision made with purpose, and over 15,000 climbs in the database and growing, it's not even a question. On all levels, the TB2 is the final boss of training boards. The mix of wood and plastic allows for skin-friendly tiny grips, as well as bigger, slopier, open-handed compression climbing. And there are 4 different board sizes to choose from, so whether you run a gym or built yourself a training shed, they've got one for you. And at the link in your show notes, you can learn all about how they made it, why they made it, and the best way for you to use it. Tension climbing. Mastery over success. Shortly after completing the trio of 8B+ at Buttes, Jerry booked a flight to Oregon, to the other super crag, the increasingly popular Smith Rock. Here, American superstar Scott Franklin had just finished Scarface, becoming the first American to establish 14A. And side note here, as history tends to do, this fact has become debated as grades get shifted. In reality, the first 14A established by an American may have been Planet Claire in the Gunks, established a year earlier in 1987 by, yes, you guessed it, Scott Franklin. Regardless, the send of Scarface meant that Smith Rock now had 3 14As of its own: To Bolt or Not to Be, White Wedding, and Scarface. Jerry got to work. At a time when 14B was the hardest grade on the planet, the vast majority of climbers with 14A on their tick list seemed to be far more interested in establishing new 14As. Not to mention, there just weren't that many to repeat. But Jerry was in a unique position. He was just over a year removed from not climbing at all, and was on a mission to prove himself. To who? Well, himself first, but also to everyone. Jerry wanted to be called the best, and he was willing to put the work in to earn that title. To him, that meant also repeating the hardest routes everywhere. So in short order, Jerry finished the Smith Triple, becoming the first person to climb all 3 of the hardest routes at both supercrags, Buttes and Smith. And certainly this catapulted him ahead a few spots in the unofficial Best in the World rankings. But was it enough? Climbing was broadening, effort was being put into different arenas, and as such, new Best in the Worlds were arising. Best what? Best on-sighter, best redpointer, sport climber, boulder, competition climber, best all-arounder who can do everything? For Jerry, the answer was simply yes, all of it. He wanted to be the best at all of it. Repeating routes was a key part of that plan, but he also knew that he needed some big first ascents. Other than Power Band, it had been a while, and at V9, that was a little off the world standard. He went to the Frankenjura. He had friends there and comfortable accommodations. He knew the rock and the area. The short, intense routes suited his style, and he could spend some time on the campus board to boost his power. While there, he belayed Wolfgang on a project that he'd been working on. Jerry went up at once to check it out, and then he couldn't get it out of his head. He'd come here for a first ascent, and here was this one just waiting. Legend has it that without telling Wolfgang, he secretly returned to the route and made the first ascent. Returning to the Oberschallenbach, he told Wolfgang, who was furious. Things were icy in the house for a few days, but it eventually got back to normal. Jerry called the route Stone Love, his first 8B+ first ascent. Another box checked. Back in the Peak District, Jerry went to an area now called Crag X, a proving ground stacked with hard boulders and even harder projects. He'd established a 7C+ or V10 here called the Hulk, and Ben Moon had been trying a harder variation of it, but hadn't managed to send the whole thing yet. And with the specter of Ben doing it first pushing him to try harder, Jerry got it done. Superman at 8A+ or V12 was one of the hardest boulders in the world. Another box, another check mark. And with nearly all boxes now checked, it became increasingly undeniable that Jerry Moffatt was, at the least, in the top few climbers worldwide. So he decided to focus on the next empty box: competition climbing. He liked that competition results were sparking speculation of who, exactly, was the very best climber. Win a few, and it'll be written in stone. Jerry Moffatt, no doubt, is the best climber in the world. Besides, he'd always been extremely competitive. This was going to be easy. While he didn't do so well in his first competitions, that could be chalked up to inexperience. And after winning a smaller comp, he assumed that he was well on his way. But at the big competitions, good performances were harder to come by. He'd climb well in qualifiers, but once through to the finals, the pressure got to him. Gibet, Glowacz, Didier, Edlanger, they were all better. He knew it. It would consume his thoughts. Through the entirety of 1988, he kept working hard, but kept coming up short. Event after event, the same story. He'd make finals, then he'd choke. To comfort himself, he'd escape to what he knew best: real rock. He was in shape, so why waste it failing at competitions? That subtle groove at Lower Pentruan wasn't going to climb itself, and he thought he might now have a chance at it. Surprisingly, he made quick progress, linking big sections. On just his third day back on the route, he came agonizingly close, falling off the last hard move. And he knew he could do it, and he knew it would be not only his hardest, but the hardest in the country. He took a rest day. Jerry loaded his bike into a van and drove to a track. Going all out would get his mind off the route, but still fill his need for power. The tires of his Suzuki, as they warmed up, seemed to get a little slippery. He noticed that they weren't responding the way he expected. But before he could slow down, going around a tight bend, the back wheel skidded out from under him, and then suddenly re-gripped, sending Jerry over the handlebars at 80 miles per hour. He broke his wrist, ribs, and several bones in his feet. He'd be out for months. The project and the competitions were done. He'd have to rebuild. It was almost enough to cause him to give up. Almost. Britain was scheduled to host its first ever World Cup climbing event in the city of Leeds, in West Yorkshire. Jerry knew what was at stake: his country in front of his people. It could prove the value of climbing competitions to the skeptical Brits. It could prove that he was the best. But failure? Could he handle that? He wasn't so sure. But he did understand that while rebuilding his body, he'd have to start working on his mind. While visiting family, he told his mom about his issues competing, and she mentioned to him that an Olympic athlete she'd read about had used a particular book to get over their psychological hurdles with competing. She tracked the book down along with cassette tapes of the author and sent it to Jerry. With Winning in Mind was written by Lanny Basham, who'd won gold for sport shooting in the 1976 Olympics. He'd just published the book in 1988, largely because he had trouble finding resources that discussed mental discipline under pressure. Jerry felt like Lanny was talking directly to him. He'd made all of these mistakes, so he read and he reread With Winning in Mind, and began to feel like this book and its lessons might indeed be exactly what he needed. It might be his secret weapon. In his training diary from the time, at the bottom of every page, Jerry wrote, "I am the best competition climber in the world. I always succeed. I always flash 8A. My footwork is precise and efficient. I move on rock fast and gracefully. I have plenty of time to work out moves because my recovery is so good. I can depump anywhere. I am the strongest, fittest climber in the world." On rock, Jerry believed this. But could he learn to believe it in competition, when it wasn't just him versus the route, but him versus the other best-in-the-world climbers? And I know that some of you listening who are really into manifesting your futures are cheering right now. But let me bring you back down to earth. Jerry did something different, something key. He then worked for it. He sorted through his doubts and imagined anything that could go wrong. The pump, spinning holds, bad feet, direct sun on the crux holds, knowing another climber had topped, all of it. He considered how to react. He planned for it. Whenever possible, he practiced it. And to make sure his physical shape matched his mental progress, he went to Crag X and created a circuit of hard boulders linked by down climbs and traverses. He'd run laps on this circuit, each time finding new motivation. "This one's for you, Didier. This one's for you, Patrick. This one's for you, Stefan." Then, the day arrived. They were all there, waiting, in isolation. All of the top competitors. They all wanted to win. What they didn't know is that Jerry had already won, dozens of times over the past few weeks. He'd already beaten them. All that was left was to climb. As before, as usual, Jerry easily made it through to finals. And walking out from isolation, he felt good. Past where many climbers had fallen, he was facing a huge move. Just before going, he hesitated. He touched the hold, but didn't quite get it right, and fell off. Luckily, at exactly the same spot as two other climbers, Simon Naden and Didier Rabitou had both missed the same move. Super final. The three climbers went back to isolation while a new route was set. Jerry sat down next to Didier, looked over at him, and smiled. "I'm winning this one today." Didier smiled back. Jerry, calm and confident, put a tape into his Walkman. But this wasn't music to get him psyched. This tape was from With Winning in Mind, narrated by Lanny Basham himself, seemingly talking directly to Jerry.
The great players of any sport, they can control the distractions that occur in a competition. Just being able to have a singular focus to say that when I get my mind set on this, I stay the course. I'm not easily distracted. Being mentally tough means that I'm able to focus on the task at hand and stay in the moment. That's certainly one of the steps to mastery.
First up was Simon, then Didier. Jerry could hear the crowd. He knew they'd both gotten high on the route, but hadn't finished it. How high? He wasn't sure. But that didn't matter. Right there at the bottom of the page in his journal, it told him, "I am the best competition climber in the world. I always succeed." With that, Jerry walked out and tied in. He started up with focus. Early on, at a difficult move, he nearly fell off but saved it. A few months ago, this would have spelled disaster. He'd have thought about how hard the rest of the route must be, how easily Didier, in his super-controlled, never-flustered style, must have done this move. While Simon, another British climber, was going to outperform him in front of the home crowd. And he'd have spiraled himself right off the wall. But that isn't what happened. Jerry continued just as focused. It hadn't rattled him at all. Soon, he was facing a steep bulge and another huge move. The crowd was quiet. He remembered his hesitation earlier and smiled. It wouldn't happen again.
I think there's a good chance he'll have worked out that it's just a jump.
Jerry went for it, his feet coming off and then his other hand. He held it. The crowd roared.
That's it, but he doesn't know it. He doesn't know that he's won.
While Jerry shook out, sorting through the options for the final boulder problem, guarding the top of the route, the announcers were incredulous. He doesn't know he's won. He heard the crowd. He knew he must have won, but that didn't matter. It wasn't going to distract him from doing what he came here to do. He was going to flash this route. He was going to prove that he was the best. He wound up for another gigantic move.
Oh, look at that. That is a tremendous move.
Look at that.
Look, he's still powering over those overhangs.
This was just incredible. Come on, Jerry, go for it. You're nearly there, man. You're nearly there.
He's got it.
Yes, he's done it. He's done it. He's done it.
That's it. That's the end of the route.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
He's won. That's it.
Over the next couple of years, Jerry won far more events than not, becoming one of the most successful competition climbers of the era. In March of 1990, he made the first ascent of that route at Lower Pentruan, Liquid Amber, named in honor of his brother, Toby. It was his first 8C, or 14B, and the first in the UK. However, with subsequent ascents, it's estimated that Liquid Amber may have been the world's first 8C+, or 14C. For a time, or for multiple times, Jerry Moffatt truly was the best. Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. Over the next couple of weeks, our patrons will be getting bonus episodes about changing ethics and the rise of competition climbing. You can join for free at the link in your show notes. And remember, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And if you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review. Join our Patreon, the Secret Stoners Club, and tell everyone you know, at the crag, at the gym, and those people whose main goal is to be the best at any cost, tell them too. And together, we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time. Secret Stoners. Feels like it's been a while, simply because I've been traveling. The Kendrick show was amazing. Had a great trip, but definitely returned feeling like I was behind. But this episode actually came together really quickly, which surprised me. But before we get into that, it's a nice, cool evening here in Lander. I've got all of the windows open. If you hear birds, if you hear cars, if you hear wind, that's why. It's basically outside in my little studio right now. And before we jump into this, I just want to shout out and say thank you to Jade, John Clark, and PBOC. I appreciate the support, our newest rock stars. Thank you. Now that I'm back talking to you in as much real time as these things ever are, this episode was supposed to be about something entirely different than it became. All the way from day one of planning, I had thought I was making an episode about Jerry Moffatt climbing the 3 14As in Bukes and then the 3 14As in Smith. at a time when 14B was the top grade in the world. In my head, that's a major achievement. On paper, that's a major achievement. I mentioned it to Alan Watts, and Alan said, yeah, it didn't seem like that big of a deal at the time. And that struck me. I started thinking about it, and I guess, standards were moving very quickly, and most people were focused on what's the next hard thing. So I could see why it wouldn't seem like a giant deal at the moment. It doesn't mean it's not a great achievement or even a big achievement for the time. And I was still going to write the episode about that, but defend why I thought that it was a great achievement. And then once I started writing, I realized that this was an episode about Jerry Moffatt's need to prove to himself, to everyone else, that he was capable of being the best. That's why he came back to climbing. At least that's how it seems to me, based on reading his book multiple times in the past few weeks. Seems like he came back to prove he was the best. And once he proved that, and proved it, I think, in a pretty strong manner, he was basically out again. And that brings me to several things. Number one, I appreciate you all, the audience who really, really cares about this thing, because I feel like I have the option to go whatever direction I think makes the most sense. But I also feel a sense of responsibility to you because I know that you care. And I like being held accountable in that manner. So I felt like I had to tell the real story. And that meant telling some things that I did not find in Jerry's book, that I did not find in any other books, that I went around asking people who were close to the situation and heard that Jerry had stolen Stone Love from Wolfgang. Jerry openly writes about the boulder that became Power Band and then the boulder that became Superman, both of which were things that Ben Moon was working on. So there's definitely, even though I don't spell it out really, even though I don't hand it to you, I'm saying, how do we feel about having to be the best at any cost? If you've read my book, Adapt, there's a chapter about Wayne Gretzky and his all-time goals record in hockey and how Alex Ovechkin was challenging that goal and I believe has since broken that goal. I think he broke it just a few months ago or broken that record. And the difference is that Gretzky is also very high on the all-time assists record board, whereas Ovechkin is nowhere to be found on the assists board. So Gretzky was scoring when it made sense for him to score. He was taking smart shots, whereas Ovechkin is just taking the shots no matter what and hoping that he scores. He's a good hockey player. He's a great hockey player. He's scoring a lot, but that's not the same as Wayne Gretzky's record, in my opinion. And I think there is a level of community and camaraderie amongst climbers that feels special to climbers. You know, I think this exists elsewhere too, but because we're climbers, we think it's super special and exists only here, and that's fine. We can think that. But if you're not a lifer, if you're not someone who's in it for that, then it maybe isn't as strong. And that's not to say Jerry didn't have great friends and that Jerry wasn't a great person to his friends. He certainly was. I've heard that over and over again. I'm not debating that at all. But I do suspect that his own need to be the best often challenged that community. And that's an interesting piece of this story to me. I asked several people to talk about whether or how they were inspired by Jerry Moffatt, and I was turned down by several people, all of whom said some variation of too competitive for me, not my kind of climber. If he'd have stuck with it, maybe something like that. And I respect that. You're welcome to your own opinions, but I also think we have to recognize that maybe climbing doesn't mean the same thing for everyone, and that's totally okay. I really loved golf for a short time. And then when I realized that it was just going to take far more time than I wanted to invest to get any better than I already was, I was like, meh, I'm done. And I went to other things. And I think that we often make the mistake as climbers of believing that everyone should love it the same way that we love it. And just because they don't, or just because they did for a short time, doesn't make them less of a climber. This was an interesting episode for me because I am one of those people who loves this thing and is in it for my life. It's saved my life in a lot of ways, and I've built my life around it. So I often make that mistake of thinking that everyone should feel the same way about it, but that just isn't true. And I'm glad that I let this episode evolve. I took it in a different direction than I thought I was going to. I just let it happen, and I think it came out to a pretty cool episode. And the footage or the audio from leads from the comp at the end of the episode, I didn't know that was going to be the end. I literally did not watch that video. I had not looked it up. I thought maybe I would end it with leads because I know that was a big moment for Jerry. But I just, on a whim, after the episode was pretty much done, went and watched the video, found a video of that moment, watched it, and was like, okay, this is the ending, and I have to put this audio in there because it's so telling. And then literally 2 minutes later, I looked up audio from Lanny Basham, the tape that Jerry was listening to from With Winning in Mind, and just plopped my cursor in the middle of the audio file, and that's the section that I came up with. And it fit the announcers perfectly. So, fate, if you believe in that kind of thing. This one felt hard and good all at the same time. Anyway, I'm rambling here. Thanks for hearing me out. Next week, I am talking with a very understated, relatively quiet climber from the UK who is a very good climber, steeped in the history, chases the history, it appears. I've never had a conversation with this person. I'm actually recording with them in a few days, so you'll be getting that conversation shortly after I record it. And I reached out to them kind of last minute, thinking, oh, this person chases history. I wonder if they'd be interested. And they were very excited to talk about Jerry. So that makes me very excited to talk to them. All right. I'll see you guys in a week.